in a way that there's two conflicting narratives that you'll often find in the public domain. The banal mainstream narrative is that everything is driven from, consumers wanting convenience. And then there's a sort of a top-down narrative, which is often where the conspiracy theorists lie, where they say stuff like, okay, it's being pushed by global elites who want to control you and so on, right? So they imagine all the power is projected downwards upon people. And all the industry says, oh, no, it's everybody on the bottom up who wants these changes to happen, right? The reality is actually that there's a complex feedback loop between all these things that are occurring.
One of the key things that we're seeing happening to all sorts of industries and has been happening to the financial sector for a long while is the digitization of our day-to-day transactions and interactions. And so what do you think are the key themes we need to be aware of in terms of how the digitization of mainstream finance is impacting us now and what the perils and possibilities are of that accelerating or expanding?
In all digitization stories, regardless of what industry it's being applied to, there's a common story. There's a common mainstream story, all right, which is that the reason why it's happening is that everybody desires convenience. All right. I mean, the story is so, it's so pervasive that it's considered just common sense, right? That the only reason why digitization occurs and stuff is because everyone desires everything to move faster, basically, right? So everyone's kind of lazy at some level. This is the basic story, okay? And this is like a very banal. I mean, there's like elements of it that maybe are true, but like it's not really the main thing that's happening in an economic system, all right? The main thing that's happening in an economic system, at least in terms of how I see stuff, is that in global capitalism for a very, very long time, stuff automates, all right? Basically, and we can get into maybe why this is the case, but in super large-scale economic systems, there are forces that are generated, okay? And this sounds a bit abstract, but, actually, one of the ways to think about this is maybe this is like a thought experiment that might help. Imagine 8 billion people blindfolded and tied together, all right, trying to find a common direction to move in.
Oh, God.
All right, and actually, it's impossible to do that through any form of conversation. And what would really happen in that situation is everybody kind of just defaults to a lowest common denominator. All right. And our economic system is quite like this. What people call capitalism has a very sort of many processes that simply default, right, to a lowest common denominator, which basically means in our systems always default to trying to get faster and trying to scale and trying to complexify, right? And so when you go anywhere in the world right now, you'll hear politicians and business leaders, they'll all endlessly talk about digital transformation, right? They'll repeat this mantra, which is and they kind of present this idea as if all of us as individual beings are the ones driving this process. So we are all the ones who want this. But then they'll kind of add in as a backstory that if you don't want it, you'll have to do it anyway, all right? And basically what they're referring to is there are processes in our economic system that are beyond our control, all right? And it will often also manifest in all these stories about races. So like a race to AI, for example, or a race to cashlessness in the case of monetary systems. So a lot of these digitization processes are essentially automation processes that are inherent to capitalism and inherent to a system that's trying to expand and accelerate, all right? And that's what's really going on in the background. But culturally, it will manifest in a whole bunch of stories that somehow we are in control of it, or we want it, blah, 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 or it's convenient and so on. So you rock up in the so-called cashless, coffee shop to get your latte, and they say, we don't accept cash, right? Most middle-class people basically will say, initially they'll be like, oh, well, I guess, okay, fine. They get out their card. The next time they won't even, they've been culturally trained now to expect that, and they will have internalized that story. All right. So it becomes hegemonic in the sense that you start to replicate the story in your own body and mind. Right. And you can easily tell this in London now. I mean, I guarantee you there's loads and loads of middle-class people in London who basically feel embarrassed about using cash. They feel embarrassed about using a non-corporate, non-automated form of payment. Okay. And that's a political, cultural, and sort of, process that has a bunch of stuff that's attached to it. Right. And so there's essentially a kind of a power grab that's going on in big finance and big tech in the monetary system. But I mean, I guess what the complexity of this is to try and understand where the agency in these systems lie, because we find this in broader digitization processes across the world, even when that, there's many digitization processes going on beyond the monetary system. And in a way, and I'll end with this here, because maybe we can, in a way that there's two conflicting narratives that you'll often find in the public domain. The banal mainstream narrative is that everything is driven from, consumers wanting convenience. And then there's a sort of a top-down narrative, which is often where the conspiracy theorists lie, where they say stuff like, okay, it's being pushed by global elites who want to control you and so on, right? So they imagine all the power is projected downwards upon people. And all the industry says, oh no, it's everybody on the bottom up who wants these changes to happen, right? The reality is actually that there's a complex feedback loop between all these things that are occurring. So recently, people like me and others have been pushing, for example, this question of cash versus digital money into the realm of financial reform thinking. People saying, actually, is that a good situation? Do we really want that situation? Won't that give banks too much power, etc.? It previously really wasn't something that was discussed very much in financial reform circles. Okay, so it's a kind of a new issue in terms of financial power, is all around the digitization data kind of element.